Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking the incredible rise and the mysterious, almost overnight, fall of Europe's first great mainland civilization, the Mycenaeans. Long before the philosophers of classical Greece were walking the streets of Athens, and honestly, centuries before the Roman Empire was even a thought, these were the people ruling the Mediterranean. They commanded formidable armies, they built these absolute fortress palaces, and then, well, we'll get to that. Picture yourself standing in front of defensive walls so staggeringly huge, they literally sparked myths. Later Greeks would look at the ruins of these fortresses and think, okay, there's absolutely no way regular humans built this. It had to be mythical giants. Tucked away in the rugged hills of southern Greece, these massive stones represent a civilization that fundamentally shaped the course of European history. So we're traveling back over 3,500 years. This is a time when master builders and fearless warriors were laying the very bedrock of ancient Greek culture. And the Mycenaeans, they didn't just survive in this tough environment, they completely thrived. They set up these vast trading networks, pushing their influence all the way from Egypt to Anatolia. They are for sure the gritty foundation of Western civilization. To see how this all stacks up, let's look at the timeline. We're tracing an explosive rise to power, followed by a sudden, dramatic disappearance. For centuries before 1600 BC, the Minoans were the big players. But then, in what's basically a historical blink of an eye, the Mycenaeans emerge. They hold on to this immense power for a few centuries, and then, right around 1200 BC, they just collapse. And it happens over just a few decades. It's wild. Now, to really get why they developed this way, you've got to consider the geography. Ancient Greece is incredibly rugged. You've got harsh mountain ranges cutting communities off into isolated valleys, plus thousands of islands just scattered across the Aegean Sea. These natural barriers essentially forced early communities to grow into fiercely independent, completely isolated, and aggressively competitive little kingdoms, rather than, one massive united nation. And you can really see the stark contrast between the two major players of the era here. On one hand, you have the island-dwelling Minoans on Crete. They're culturally sophisticated, they're relatively peaceful, they're dominating maritime trade, and painting these beautiful, colorful frescoes. On the other hand, you have the early mainland Greeks. They started out as gritty, small farming communities, but through agriculture, metalworking, and just sheer ambition, their local leaders started piling up some serious wealth and power. Well, that ambition fully boiled over around 1600 BC. Centered on the city of Mycenae in the Peloponnesus, these newly wealthy mainland rulers started constructing heavily fortified citadels right on top of rocky hills. And these were definitely not just homes. These were massive defensive strongholds. They projected absolute military strength and total political dominance over all the surrounding valleys. The crucial thing to take away here is that these fortress cities were explicitly designed for war. Unlike the Minoans with their peaceful, unfortified palaces, the Mycenaeans surrounded themselves with terrifyingly massive limestone blocks. These are the famous Cyclopean walls. Like I mentioned earlier, later generations genuinely believed the mythical one-eyed Cyclopes were literally the only beings strong enough to lift these stones into place. Sitting at the very top of this impenetrable society was a figure wielding immense power, the Wanox. And the Wanox wasn't just your average king handling taxes and leading armies. No, he held absolute centralized authority over political and religious affairs, ruling everything right from the royal palace at the heart of the citadel. But, a king can't do it all alone. He relied on a highly organized hierarchy to keep things running. He had military commanders enforcing his will, priests keeping the gods happy, scribes meticulously recording every trade and tax, and skilled artisans building up the kingdom's wealth. Together, this whole apparatus controlled absolutely everything in their region. It's super important to remember, though, that Mycenaean Greece was not a single unified empire. It was a collection of independent palace-states. Places like Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, and even early Athens. And while they frequently competed and definitely clashed with one another, they were tightly bound together. They shared a language, they shared religious traditions, and most importantly, they shared a fiercely competitive martial culture. Because unlike the Minoans, the Mycenaeans were utterly defined by their military strength. They were a warrior society through and through. Young noblemen were trained for battle from a really early age. In their world, military success wasn't just some civic duty,
It was literally the primary way you achieved prestige, wealth, and lasting political influence.
Just look at the gear they carried into battle. Finely crafted bronze swords, incredibly unique helmets made out of layers of actual boar's tusks, and beautifully decorated armor. These weren't just practical tools for surviving a fight, they were the ultimate status symbols. When a Mycenaean warrior walked into a room wearing the setup, everyone instantly understood exactly how much power and honor he held.
And this highly disciplined fighting force, along with their deeply ingrained ideals of loyalty, courage, and honor, they didn't just fade into history, they became the very foundation for the Iliad and the Odyssey. When we read Homer's epics today, we're actually reading the cultural echoes of the Mycenaean world and their larger-than-life warrior ethos.
But this all brings up a massive question, doesn't it? How did a society so intensely focused on fighting and building giant rock walls manage to accumulate such staggering, legendary riches? Because the wealth they amassed was completely unlike anything mainland Greece had ever seen before. Well, the answer to that actually lay buried in the dirt until the 19th century. Enter archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann was absolutely convinced that Homer's epic tales weren't just myths, but real historical facts just waiting to be uncovered. So he traveled to the ancient citadel of Mycenae, started digging, and against all odds successfully unearthed their royal burial grounds.
And what Schliemann found in that dirt was just breathtaking. It was concrete evidence of their total dominance. He pulled hordes of luxury goods right out of the earth: pure gold cups, heavily jeweled weapons, intricately crafted jewelry, and ornate bronze armor. It proved once and for all that the mythical wealth described in ancient Greek poems was very, very real.
The absolute crowning jewel of this whole discovery was this magnificent golden funeral mask. Schliemann famously, and actually incorrectly, claimed he was gazing upon the face of Agamemnon himself. Modern science tells us this mask predates the legendary king by a couple of centuries, but honestly, it doesn't matter. It perfectly symbolizes the extraordinary power and sort of divine prestige of the Mycenaean ruling elite. They leveraged this immense wealth to become the undisputed superpower of the Late Bronze Age. Through aggressive trade networks, incredibly clever diplomacy, and just relentless military campaigns, their influence expanded rapidly across the Mediterranean. Their merchants and diplomats were out there actively exchanging goods and letters with massive global players. We're talking the pharaohs of Egypt, the powerful Hittite Empire in Anatolia, all the way to the rulers of Cyprus. But, as we know, with great wealth comes incredibly dangerous ambition. By the late 13th century BC, they had reached their absolute zenith. Yet within just a handful of decades, this entire golden age would suddenly and violently vanish around 1200 BC. It leaves us wondering, what catastrophic events could possibly bring down such an invincible superpower? To understand their peak and maybe the beginning of their end, we really have to look at their most famous military campaign, the Trojan War. According to tradition, a massive coalition of Greek kings sailed across the Aegean to besiege the wealthy city of Troy, all because the Trojan prince Paris took Helen, the wife of King Menelaus. Now, this was long dismissed as pure myths, but modern archaeology at Troy actually reveals layers of violent destruction. It strongly suggests Homer's epic preserves the very real memory of Mycenaean kings using their vast armies to crush Anatolian rivals. So during this 13th century BC golden age, palaces are expanding and royal storerooms are just overflowing with imported ivory, colorful glass, and pure gold. Exchanging letters with the Hittites and Egyptian pharaohs, their future seemed completely secure, but beneath all this glittering prosperity, a perfect storm of severe, interconnected challenges was quietly brewing across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Then, around 1200 BC, something extraordinary and truly terrifying happened. The Mycenaean kingdoms, along with empires across the known world, suffered a catastrophic, systemic collapse. Researchers now think it wasn't just one single event. It was more like a rapid domino effect of disasters. We're talking powerful earthquakes shattering cities, prolonged droughts sparking devastating famines, violent internal rebellions, and highly destructive invasions by these mysterious marauders known as the Sea Peoples. As this multi-system crisis spread, the highly organized world of the Mycenaean kings just rapidly and completely disintegrated. Palace after magnificent palace was burned, abandoned, or destroyed. The great citadel of Mycenae was severely damaged. Pylos was consumed by fire. Their elaborate administrative systems just completely stopped functioning.
Their written language, Linear B, it vanished entirely from everyday use. International trade evaporated, and population levels absolutely plummeted.
Following this massive collapse, Greece plunged into what historians call a dark age, a period lasting centuries where large cities disappeared and life became fiercely local and much simpler. Yet, incredibly, the memory of the Mycenaean world survived. Those stories of heroic kings and distant battles were passed down by word of mouth, eventually birthing the legends of classical Greece. It leaves us with a fascinating, pretty provocative question. If a civilization this powerful and deeply entrenched can vanish almost overnight, leaving behind only echoes and epic poems, what does that say about the fragility of our own modern world? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the past.